everyone. Thanks for showing up. Today we're going to talk about about the last 18 months maybe we've been working on trying to improve our approach to incorporating build limits into our capacity expansion model. I'm not going to give you any results because they're not actually public yet. This is describing what we have done for our 2026 annual planning outlook, and those kind of CapEx results will be published sometime in July. But I can give you insight into what we learned through the process and what we're going to fix and change moving forward for the 2027 analysis. So today, just going to go through some background of where we've come from on this topic, why build limits are important, get into the approach we started with, how we integrated it into PLEXOS, and then, as I said, some initial findings and what we've identified as important next steps for us. And so I think build limits are one of those underappreciated but potentially really important inputs into your capacity expansion model. The pace at which you can build stuff out really has an impact on your final destination. And so kind of when we started doing capacity expansion work in Ontario, it was about 2022, and we didn't really have the slightest clue as to what you could do. Demand had been flat for a while. We hadn't had to build much stuff recently, and so we just kind of looked to the past and said, okay, what's the most we've built of a type of resource in a year? And said, okay, we can probably do that again, right? It's not really particularly robust. It's not really informed by what we may need and where things are going, but it's what we had and what we did. And so our previous work was based on that. But more and more, stakeholders would come and say, well, I don't think you can do that. I think this could be higher, and try to poke holes in it. And so we said, okay, this is something we really need to drill into. And let's go build a robust process for it. In terms of why they matter, and this is just like a very minor sensitivity I did off our first capacity expansion results, which was like a net zero pathway from 2022. When you use those pretty constrained build limits that I described, and that's the blue bars. Basically, there's no price sensitivity to nuclear, right? It has nothing else to build, so it is going to build nuclear because it needs to build something, right? When you take the build limits out of the model and then do a price sensitivity, you get an entirely different picture where it's going to build way more or way less on somewhat small variations in price, right? So the pace at which you assume a resource can be built, it can be quite quite determinative in the model into the end amount that you will build of that resource. So knowing this and knowing we wanted to get better, we went out and we did an RFP for a consultant, and we were pretty clear of what we were looking for. We wanted annual build limits by resource, maybe a total resource build limit, and maybe a total cumulative annual build. So what can we build of any resource in a year? What is the most of that type of resource we could build over a 25-year period? And is there kind of a overall constraint within a year? That's what we were looking for. Nice, simple, you can put it into PLEXOS pretty easily and then go off and run as many capacity expansions as you want. What we received was not that. It was a top-down global supply model and build out that considers the land availability in Ontario, it considers the labor availability, all types of interesting global supply chain stuff. It has 30 sheets of Excel filled with data, 600 plus inputs, 77 outputs, and no firm build limits. So that is what we got from the consultant, and then we started on our own odyssey to make sense of what do we do with this thing that we just spent a bunch of time and money on and get something useful out of it. So in terms of how it treats each of those things, so it's really, there's three main constraints that the consultant came up with: labor, land, labor, and manufacturing. Obviously, there's other constraints that aren't captured within that, but those were kind of identified as the three major ones. And so most of these, actually, they're all pretty much top-down. So you start big picture, you know, for land, what's the total amount of land in Ontario? You know, there's all types of exclusions like parkland, riverways, First Nations reserves. We've got a number of communities that have let us know that they would not be willing hosts for wind generation in the future, so we can strike them off the list. And any other types of exclusions you might want to come up with. And so you kind of selectively carve out parts of the province that aren't available for generation, and you're left over with the parts that are, and that informs your land availability. For Ontario, we're a pretty big spot. I looked it up just before. We're 55% bigger than Texas. Land is not really a constraining factor most of the time. So, you know, we're looking at something like 7,000 gigawatts of solar if we wanted it. Our load is not that high. Land is not the issue. So, for the most part, that kind of doesn't become a binding thing in this model. So it's really then down to labor and manufacturing. And so for labor, it was a similar kind of top-down process in the model. It's trying to look at kind of, you know, what's the labor force generally going to be in Ontario, you know, break it down into different types of unemployment, new employment, what's the rate of graduation, to what extent can you guide those graduates into different parts of the labor force, retrain them from one part of the labor force to the other. And then, you know, once they are in and trained in a certain technology type to install it, how productive are they going to be on a yearly basis? Like, what does one FTE, how many megawatts of wind can one FTE by themselves out there in a field make in a year? And so it is a bit more nuanced than that because it does allow for retraining, right? So if you want over time to start focusing on one type of resource and then move to another resource, you can take that labor out of the model for a while and retrain it and then redeploy it and kind of incentivize things in different ways. But essentially, again, it's kind of top-down people and into kind of more fine-grained buckets of what they can do and how they can do it. And so there is this interdependency then within labor, right? If you want to focus on solar, you're going to put more of your labor force looking at solar, but the rates at which you can build, a person can build solar panels is going to be different than which they can build a nuclear power plant or a wind turbine. So there are then trade-offs between how your labor is allocated within the economy. And then finally, there's manufacturing. Again, it's top-down in this model, and so it's really looking at what is the, you know, what is the global forecast for manufacturing capacity, what percentage of that is probably going to come to Canada over time, and then within that kind of Canadian import, what percentage of that is going to be directed towards Ontario. So pretty high level, lots of room for error bars on that. And you can see it's very much by different component parts. So this is like a flow chart for wind turbine nacelles, and it's got all types of other different component pieces as well. So pretty detailed, but then also highly uncertain, because to accurately forecast all of these inputs is a bit of a Herculean feat. So when you look at, and so they gave us two benchmarking scenarios, like a kind of lower scenario and a higher scenario. And as I said, land is not the binding constraint here. It varies kind of on an overall basis between labor and manufacturing. So we have this spreadsheet now, and we can adjust the inputs to our heart's desire and come up with different limits. The question then for us as the modelers is, how do we take this somewhat cumbersome spreadsheet and turn it into a set of PLEXOS inputs that we can use and inform our capacity expansion decisions. So we thought about it for a while, and what we came up with was a kind of iterative approach where we would let PLEXOS and the model work together to decide what the best use of the different binding constraints was. So the thought would be, let's do first like an unconstrained capacity expansion where we, just based purely on economics, say PLEXOS thinks, build this amount of resources. And then you can put that into the build limits model and see, well, does that work? And if not, how do you reallocate it? How do you assign your labor, right? Labor is globally fixed, but then kind of can be allocated to different parts of the economy to build different types of resources. And so you have that kind of flexibility within the build limits model. And so to simplify it, we did this on a decade by decade basis as opposed to trying to be overly prescriptive for each year of our planning cycle, which goes out to 2050. So we've got one number for a resource in the 2020s, one for the 2030s, and one for the 2040s. In terms of the flow chart, as I said, we start with a PLEXOS run where there's no build limits. We take those outputs, put it into the labor distribution of the build limits model, and come up with some overall limits. Then we put that back into PLEXOS and do another capacity expansion run. And then we come to the first and most important question of most modeling exercises: do these results make sense? Right? And then we have to, and usually the answer was no. And then we had to decide why they don't make sense. Was it a CapEx issue? Like, we're modeling things wrong, or is it a build limits issue? And so we would then kind of iterate back through and start again until we finally got to the point where we said, yeah, these results by and large make sense. And then hopefully over time they were going to converge, right? Hopefully what PLEXOS wanted to build and what the build limits said PLEXOS could build would align, and we'd have a good sense of like, this is what is cost optimal and is supported by like reasonable build limits. And then we could publish those results and do it again next year. And so that's what we did. Like we essentially did this flow chart. As I said, it was a bit painful at times. But I think the process of doing it was what was kind of informative and useful for this crowd. And I think this is where the real learnings are. And so the first finding, and this is no surprise, it's talked about at most energy conferences, but the manufacturing limits were like really binding for new turbines, both hydroelectric and for gas, right? And so especially in our higher demand case, but even in the reference case, it was really difficult to make a model that worked, to come up with a solution. And we had a lot of internal debate, like, okay, do we just publish results where capacity expansion can't solve the system, and we just say, we're not going to be able to get stuff fast enough to be adequate, so do with that what you will. And we thought, no, we probably shouldn't do that. We should probably actually solve the thing. So we had to relax our manufacturing limits on turbines, certainly in the near term, just to give it enough of a head start to build what it wanted. So that was one kind of interesting finding. The iterative process was, as I mentioned, somewhat painful. We already are kind of iterating enough with capacity expansion between kind of resource adequacy checks and unserved energy checks to throw in build limits checks as well. Really prolonged a lot of the work, and it took a lot of time and a lot of kind of head scratching as to why is it doing this. And so, at one point it was not converging and just building ever increasing amounts of PV and battery until we kind of intervened and had to do some manual overrides. So I think like the theoretical and conceptual idea of iteration to convergence was right, but it didn't actually turn out to be a practical strategy for us. The other thing, kind of given those understandings of the manufacturing limits that we had a lot of internal discussion on was, again, you know, no surprise, but as planners, we deal with an uncertainty. How certain are we in our projections on what the manufacturing capability of the world economy is over the next 25 years? And if we're hitting our kind of limited, like, if we're banging into a wall in terms of how much we can buy, presumably other jurisdictions are going to be banging into that wall as well. And there are these great, you know, for-profit manufacturers who will see that and probably increase their manufacturing capability over time to respond to that. So do we really want to lock in a pathway based on our assumptions of what we can build now that doesn't respond to those market conditions? And we didn't want to have to come up with another iterative thing within the build limits model itself to capture that and then try to be like econometric global modelers as well. So we weren't too interested in pursuing that much further. So what we kind of landed on for the next cut that we're going to start in the next couple months is that we're going to kind of ignore within the model those larger feedbacks between labor and manufacturing. And we're going to try to put the direct limits that we're interested in right into PLEXOS, get rid of the iterative approach, and focus on the labor side, really just labor allocation, right? So right now our build limits are kind of on a megawatt basis. We're going to turn the build limits into a person hour basis and have, you know, a constraint based on the productivity of people and the amount of capacity they can build, such that in any given year we're not using more people hours than are available to us. And so let the model kind of optimally dispatch people to build stuff and not iterate back and forth. And then for manufacturing, you know, we recognize that there are real constraints. Like, you can't just go out and get a turbine right now and just build it, but that is most likely to change over the long run. So for our kind of procurement timeline, which is the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to stick with the manufacturing limits that the model suggests, but then we're going to relax them. Maybe not just kind of immediately take them out after 7 years, but kind of slowly let them dissipate so that we're not constraining ourselves to like a very specific pathway in the long run and giving the model that flexibility in the long run to come up with a different solution that you might otherwise come up with. So, next steps, as I said, we're releasing the results from the painful study in July or August of this year, and then we're going to try to take all those learnings and put them into the next iteration of the model. And in our results, we're going to, you know, use this as a platform to flag to policymakers and decision makers that, like, you know, the pace at which things need to be built to make these kind of astronomical growth projections have real constraints in terms of the pace at which you can build stuff. And here are some of the pinch points, right, that maybe policy can help address, be it turbine manufacturer or you know, training skilled workers to build different types of resources. So that's where we've landed up with. Hopefully our pain can be to your benefit and you don't try and do an iterative build process and skip straight to the good stuff. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks. Maybe I missed it at the beginning. I missed the first few minutes, but I think you didn't discuss or mention anything about maybe the interconnection process being a constraint in there and limiting the amount of capacity you could build in any given year. Is that something you'll consider? Is that like a real maybe binding limit in?
So the IESO, so we're unique among system operators, as far as I know, compared to our US counterparts. We control, for the most part, the procurement and connection process. So our market prices are not sufficient to induce anybody to just connect to the grid and make money. You end up needing to get a long-term power contract with us. And so we run regular cadenced procurements. We're kind of doing it on an annual basis right now because of the needs we're facing. And part of that process involves like deliverability screenings, interconnection assessments, and all that. So it's built into our procurement process so that once a project gets a contract and is ready to go, all of that stuff is kind of taken care of and they can just go build. So we don't have kind of this, backlog queue of people looking to connect with us. It's all kind of part of our procurements.
Thanks. I was just questioning with the Excel tool that helps determine those build limits. Is that being deployed in any other areas outside of Ontario? And if not, like, do you see as like that tool being adaptable to other areas?
I mean, it was a custom-built solution from a consultant. So presumably that consultant or other consultants could build that type of thing, but it's not. I mean, I suppose we could make it available and you could go change whatever inputs you wanted to reflect your region. I'm not sure who owns what within that, though. I'd have to check. I think there was one up here.
I'm curious if you can share from your labor model just relatively what is the most efficient resource to build from a labor standpoint?
That's a good question. Does this red? There we go. That's not something I've thought too much about, but this problem. Oh, you're not seeing it. Oh, there you are now. Let's try and figure it out together. And this kind of just describes the one-to-one trade-offs between wind and solar, wind and battery, and wind and BSS. It would suggest to me that wind's most productive, but I might be interpreting that wrong on the fly. It either is or it isn't. That's your answer. All right, thank you.